Hello, everyone. My name is Karissa Jones, and I'll be going to my third year of kindergarten. So today, what I want to show you or teach you is how to create an engaging lesson for your kiddos. So we know that students, especially this young, need to be engaged and or they're not going to be learning. So today what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you some examples, and I'm also going to be talking a little bit about my experience and what I've learned on how to engage students. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll get started. All right. So to create an engaging lesson plan, you need a few things. And the one that we're going to be talking about today is how to connect with your students. So an important thing that I've learned in my 5 years of teaching is whenever you're teaching them something that's a standard, something that you have to teach, or something that you just want to teach, you have to be able to connect it to the students and connect it to the real world. So today, what I'm going to show you is a lesson that I did on comparing and contrasting using our reading curriculum. And I'm going to show you how I kind of engaged my students and ways that you can connect my students with comparing and contrasting. So when you're when you're trying to connect with students, something important that you should do at the beginning of the year is kind of learn about your students and learn who they are and what kind of learner they are, what interests them, so that you can pull these things into your lesson. So that to keep your kids engaged. I know I have a class of 30 kindergartners. So it's a lot, and it can be difficult, but once you really learn who they are and what interests them, it's easy to connect them into the lesson and engage them. So what I'm going to show you, like I said, is I'm going to show you how to engage them at the beginning of the lesson and connect them with their real world experiences. And especially with comparing and contrasting, I was also able to connect our own classroom into the lesson. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a video, and I'm going to kind of show you how I engaged my students and how I connected them to the lesson prior to teaching it. So this video is going to show you how I opened the lesson up, because the lesson is on comparing and contrasting of a science book, but that's not how I opened it up. I opened it up with a real life experience that kids can relate to. And that's also important too, is how can they relate to this lesson? What can you pull in that they are going to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or something that they've done before they can relate to. And especially because they're kids, pull something in that's fun as well. So I will go ahead and show you the video. So this video is from my past year. And like I said, we were comparing and contrasting weather and seasons. And to some students, the book's going to be like, it's going to be like, oh, like, I don't really know what this is. Or some of the weather, especially here in Chicago, kids cannot relate to. So it's important that when you're using the curriculum, you supplement some things that they can connect to, especially since, there's like tsunamis. Like my kiddos in Chicago are not going to be able to connect with that. So it's important that you kind of supplement and pull in things that they can relate to, so that they're able to relate to it. Let me go ahead and show you this quick little video.
You outside and you have a popsicle and it's really hot outside. What happens to that popsicle? What caused it to melt? The sun being hot.
So as you see, what I did here is I chose popsicles. Kids love popsicles, and that is something that I knew, especially with my kiddos. They love popsicles, and I've done like popsicle Fridays. So I knew that they love that, and I know that that's something that they can relate to. As you can see, to kind of manage my students, I made sure to model what I wanted them to do to be able to answer the question. And then I also kept them, engaged with the lesson by using something that they already know. And as you can see, a lot of them were like so quick to raise their hands because they know what happens to a popsicle when it's hot outside. And I also made sure to use the words, the vocabulary that they're trying to learn in the point of the lesson. So I made sure to use the words compare and contrast so that they're kind of starting to gauge that vocabulary and they're starting to understand what we're going to be talking about. So that is one example that I used, but I didn't stop there. And I'll show you my next one.
So the sun is hot. That is the cause. The effect, Lucia, is the ice cream melted. What about if I am going to the pool and I jump in the water and I get out? What happens? Analia? It's cold and you are wet.
As you can see here again, I use something like the pool. Most kids love the pool and going swimming. So I use an example that they would understand to kind of gauge their interest when we're going into the lesson about comparing and contrasting. So, and as you can see again, I made sure to model how I wanted them to respond, and I wasn't going to take them, yelling the answer. It's also important because, kids can get very excited. It's important to always make sure you're modeling how you want these answers to look.
What caused you to get wet? Water. The water. So.
And as you can see, I had another student call out the answer, but I made sure again, I'm not going to answer you unless you are showing me how I want you to raise your hand. So I use an example that kids can relate to. And as you can see, a majority of my students had something to say because they were able to relate to that experience. They were able to relate to, oh, I got out of the pool. What happened? I'm wet and I'm cold. And I use that vocabulary so that when we go into the lesson about weather and seasons, they're already going to have an idea and they're already going to have that vocabulary so that we can use that throughout our lesson.
The water caused the effect.
And notice how I over enunciated that vocabulary that we're learning so that I can, my students can understand how to use it and hopefully start to use it throughout a lesson.
Being. So today we are going to look at this.
And also notice that keeping kids engaged, especially this young, their attention span is plus or minus 2 minutes of their age. So it's important to make sure that these lessons, they're intentional and they're not too long so that you're keeping their interest throughout the lesson. And notice how I had a student not following my expectations, and rather than calling them out, I just tapped them on the shoulder. They knew exactly what they were supposed to do because it is super, super easy to lose their interest and lose their attention if you're worrying about a student not following direction and you're talking to them. Because while you're talking to them, you have, your other 20 plus students waiting for you. So it's important that you also make sure that that redirection is not, it's just a short and quick thing.
During the weather and the seasons, you guys are going to help me identify some cause and effect relationships in the story.
And see how I use those two examples to lead into my lesson. I use the same vocabulary. So today we're going to be using cause and effect to compare the relationships between the weather and the seasons on the story. So now that I've engaged them, now that they're engaged and I've used experiences that they can relate to, now we can go into the lesson about the weather and the seasons. And this video is pretty long. So let's see if I can skip a little bit. So it's important also. So I use these anchor charts, it's kind of hard to see. So kids also need visuals. So I use this chart. Again, I apologize. It is kind of hard to see, but one side was cause and one side was effect so that they could visually see the cause and the effect relationship throughout the story. And again, this story had a lot of weather that they could not relate to. So I made sure to talk about mainly focus on the weather that they know, but it's also important that they know about this other weather that they cannot relate to. It's just not a part of the story that I focus heavily on just because it's not something that they can relate to. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So like I said, it's important to engage students and ensure that whatever you're teaching them is something that they can relate to. So also while doing cause and effect, something that I did was I wanted to relate it to our classroom. So what I did is I had them on the carpet and I went over to my light switch and I turned it off. And I said, I asked them, I'm like, okay, what just happened? Oh, Miss Jones, you turned off the light. Okay. I turn off the light. So what happened? It's dark. Okay, what caused it to be dark? Oh, you turned off the light. There's a cause and effect relationship that they can relate to because they see it every day. It's something that it's one of their classroom jobs is to turn on the light and turn off the light. And also like using their crayons and their pencils. So something that I also did was I showed a sharpened pencil and I showed a dull pencil. And I said, okay, what happened to this pencil? Or like I compared them, like, well, how are they different? And then I'm like, all right, why is this pencil dull? What happened? What caused it to be dull? So as I wanted to continue using that vocabulary, I would use that vocabulary in cause and effect relationships in our school throughout the week. So I really could gauge their understanding and see if they were catching on to the concept of compare and contrast. And I made sure to only use things that they can relate to. Okay, so the cause and effect relationships at school, at home, outside for recess, things that they enjoy, which, like I said, again, it's important to get to know your students and understand what they like and what interests them so that you can keep their interests throughout the lesson and use examples throughout the day to be able to, you know, kind of like quiz them, like see what they know, like an informal observation. So something that you should always do to make sure you're creating an engaging lesson plan is to make it purposeful. Plan out what you're going to do, plan out your activities, plan out how the beginning of the lesson is going to look, the middle of the lesson is going to look, and the end of the lesson is going to look. So you've got to make sure you have all your stuff prepared, and you need to be intentional, because one thing that I've learned being a teacher is if you are not on it, you don't have all your stuff prepared, you are going to lose your students. Make sure that everything you do is intentional, it's ready to go, and it's prompt. Because like I said, we know that especially in early childhood, you got kiddos from, you know, 2 years old to 6 years old and beyond. And like I said, their attention span is going to be plus or minus 2 minutes, or plus or minus 2 minutes of their age. So you've got to make sure you're always on the ball. That is something that's so important. And I stress to people all the time, even new teachers that I mentor, you've got to be prepared, because if you're not prepared and you are just going on a whim, you are going to lose your students, and that is where you see behavior problems. So make sure you are being intentional, make sure you have your activities ready, and make sure you know exactly what you're doing and what you're teaching so that you have your students' attention the entire time, and making sure that's engaging. So what I do to gauge my students' interests, or not get to know my students at the beginning of the year, is I do some get to know you activities. We do a circle time every day, and I ask the question of the day, like, what's your favorite toy? What's your favorite movie? What is your favorite thing to do at home? What do you like to do outside? And I take all that into account, and I make sure to use it in my lessons. I use it to relate them to the lesson. Like I said, if you use an example or something that they cannot relate to, they're not going to grasp the concept that you're teaching as well as they would if you use an example that they could relate to. So what I also like to do to engage their interests and kind of gauge those higher order thinking questions, I always create questions that I had already planned out before I started my lesson. So when we were talking about weather and comparing and contrasting, I'm like, I wonder what happens when there's thunder, or I wonder why that happened. And nobody, and I make sure that I make it clear that sometimes I'm not sure about why that is, and this is why we're learning so that we can figure it out. Or I wonder why it rained, or I wonder how the rain affected you know, a character in the story. So I always make sure to use engaging questions so that students start to think about the concept, so that when we're doing it in real time during the lesson, they're able to relate and they're able to start thinking about the questions that we asked them at the beginning. It's always important to like gauge that thinking so that throughout the lesson they're starting to understand the questions that they had. So before I started the lesson, like before I started reading, or even when I went page by page and season by season, before I read, I asked them questions and I had them look at the pictures like, what do you see? Why do you think there's lightning on the page? What do you think is happening? Why do you think that's happening? And then they turn and talk to their friends. I give them about 30 seconds to talk about what they see. And then I read that section. And then after that, we kind of discuss some cause and effect relationships on that page, and then we jot them down. And I always make sure to only use the answers that my students give me so that they understand that their answers are important, and they kind of understand how they got to that answer, and you know, what is cause and effect, and giving that visual for them to be able to see. So what I want you to start thinking about is, you know, while you're teaching or while you're student teaching or whatever you're going into, I want you to start thinking about how you are going to engage your students' interests through the lesson that you're going to teach. I want you to think about being intentional, like look at the curriculum beforehand, look at the lesson you're going to teach in this, if you're using a story, and think about, oh, like they might not understand that. So what is the way that what can I pull in to make it more engaging and help them to understand it more? So make sure that you're always being intentional, looking at the lesson beforehand, looking at the story beforehand, so that in case you need to pull something in, you can. Make sure that you have all your activities ready, make sure everything is ready and prepared and ready to go so that you can keep their attention, and make sure that you use real life experiences that they can connect to, so that they at the opening, right, you got them right at the beginning of the lesson, and now they're engaged and ready to go because they know it's something that they can relate to. Like I did the ice cream example and the pool example, and make sure to also use those real life experiences that they can relate to throughout the day, so that you're continuously using that new vocabulary, and it's something that they're not going to forget. And I hope you guys have learned something from this lesson about engaging lessons and how to keep them engaged and how to relate the lesson to their real world experiences.